From a defabricated garden shed in Rockland County, New York, USA, this is Stand Up with Pete Dominic. On today's episode, helpful techniques at the office for giving clandestine flip-offs. And now, the podcast host who has no use for office flip-off techniques because he works in a shed, Pete Dominic.
Yes, thank you, Pete Co. Here I am in the shed where a lot of drama this evening as I'm putting together today's episode, which welcomes, by the way, Dave Rothkopf and Anya Kamanetz. Awesome conversations with both of these guests. You're going to love them both. But the drama was, I don't know if it's this time of year or what is going on, but there's a lot of bugs, a lot of weird bugs out here in the back right corner of my yard in Rockland County, just north of New York City, here at the end of August, the end of summer. First, I am sitting here doing my work, and I look down and I see this big old spider. I usually don't get too many bugs in here. I'm pretty lucky, pretty airtight. Nick DiFabrizio did a very good job insulating this place for me. But big old spider, so I put a jar over him or her, and I tossed it out. I like spiders. I'm not too scared of bugs. They weird me out a little bit. I don't want to share too much space with them. How about that? That's where I am at the spectrum. And I tossed out the spider, and then, honest to God, as I tossed the spider out, the shed doors open. A giant thing, a winged thing, flies in. So while I'm getting rid of huge wolf furry spider, a huge wing thing comes in. And sorry for those of you that get really weirded out by bug talk or bugs, but this is just what happened. This is my life, and I thank you for supporting it. But this wing thing looked like some giant green grasshopper. I could probably look it up right now easily and tell you exactly what the species and genus is, but I'm not going to do that because I'm just riffing here. And this thing goes, because it's just too weird that I throw one bug out and another one comes flying in. It was like somebody was playing a prank. Like someone was outside throwing bugs in the studio. And then, so I caught that one. He wasn't too quick. He's easy to get out. Same thing. Put him in a jar and toss him right back out. And then here I am sitting in front of my computer. And then exact same, maybe it's the same one, but another giant grasshopper just hops onto the keyboard. So I got him or her out of here as well. It prefers they, that one. Anyway, that's my life here in the shed, hosting this podcast, which I love doing so much. Thank you very much for listening to it and subscribing to it and supporting it and me. And those of you who do are paid subscribers should be getting an email, as you do every morning, with a photo, a nice, beautiful photo of nature, no man-made objects, no men or humans in it at all, sent in by another subscriber, wherever they are, all over the world, all over the country. You get that email. You also get a link to tonight and every Thursday's hangout. We have a great time every Thursday night. 30, 40, 50, 60 people usually will join us, and it's like stand-up. I'm doing crowd work, and people share stories, and it can be poignant and thoughtful and awesome and funny, and I hope you'll join us tonight. That's Thursdays at 8 p.m. for stand-up subscribers. Go to standupwithpete.com, standupwithpete.com right now. And wow, I've already had an amazing week, and you're listening here on Thursday, but I took a week off last week, and this week felt, I guess, the need to make up for it, and I booked the show at the beginning of the week, something I never do. I like to stay nimble and make sure I can book relevant guests, and sometimes I'm just lazy and I don't do a good job booking, and that's why most shows have a full-time booker. But it's also the strength of the show because I know so many people and I reach out to them and they usually say yes, almost always. And so I'm very excited to have Dave Rothkopf and Anya Kamanetz today. But man, have I gotten the opportunity to talk to some amazing people this week. Coming up, Andrew Spar of the Florida Education Association. I've got Dr. Aaron Carroll. I've got Amy Westervelt, who I just had an unbelievable, thoughtful, amazing conversation with. Love her. Find out that she's good friends with Mara Quint. So really exciting guests coming up the rest of the week. And of course, I had a really great conversation with Bill Boyle as well that I can't wait to share. That guy is so fascinating and such a good friend of mine. And I loved talking with him that I got to post up. So all of this has encouraged me to put more stuff up in different places, basically. I mean, if I've done the interview, if it's in the can, I might as well share it. So, and I love doing these interviews. I love doing 2 or 3 conversations a day and preparing for them. And if I can, find a way to continue to monetize this, it's just, I have these great conversations. I work really hard to prepare for them, and they usually go pretty well. I edit them up, make them sound a little nicer, a little sweeter, including myself. Boy, do I have a lot of glitches and annoying things that I do. You probably already know about that because you listen. Anyway, I am so grateful to you. And by the way, I'm doing really well. A couple of you have reached out and said, I can hear in your voice that you're doing well. Yes, a huge weight has been lifted off of me, and I'm feeling very healthy and in a positive place. And I'm really working this meditation practice each and every day, this kind of thing that I do every day, remind myself who I want to be each day. Every day, I recommit to working on the things that I'm bad at and deciding who I want to be and making these choices. And I sit there for 20 minutes and I fucking remind myself of that. And I clear my head, no screens, and I just sit wide awake, but with my eyes closed, trying to focus in on my breath, saying certain mantras like, let me not overreact, let me be patient, let me be. And then I do a gratefulness journal. I'm so grateful for the health I have right now in this moment and that of my family. And I literally go through several people that I'm closest with, and sometimes even some of you, I throw you in there. And it's really working for me. It's really decreasing my stress, my anxiety. I feel better in so many different ways, and I feel better in how I relate to people, including my wife, my daughters, and grasshoppers and spiders, everything. So I am doing good. So let's get to the show. I'm sorry, I'm rambling here, but I have 2 awesome guests that I think are going to love both of these guests. I know it. Oh my gosh, such great conversation with both Anya Kamanetz and Dave Rothkopf. I hope you'll listen to both of them. So coming up, Anya, but first, I've got the host of Deep State Radio, ladies and gentlemen, which is a great podcast you should listen to. He's a foreign policy, national security, kind of political affairs analyst and commentator. He's a columnist for the Daily Beast, member of the USA Today Board of Contributors, author of 10 books. His newest is out this November. You can order it now. It's called American Resistance, the untold story of how the deep state saved the nation. And I love our conversations. He is quickly and recently, you can tell by how often I invite him on the show, become one of my favorite people to talk to. He is David Rothkopf, I learned, not Dave. You'll have to wait for that. Go follow him on Twitter at DJ Rothkopf. Listen to Deep State Radio. Order his new book. Here we go, Dave. Let's do it. I start with real ass-kissing. I was just listening to Deep State Radio. I love that podcast, so I wanted to open with pandering. I've just read your Daily Beast columns, which I want to talk with you about. You do great work, Dave, and I think everybody should subscribe to your work. And, of course, get your new book. How about that? How about that for an opening?
This opening could just go on and on. I think it's great. It's totally mutual, by the way, Pete, but I appreciate it. And we have kept growing, and the new book comes out November 1st, and I encourage everybody to go get it.
Yeah, so let's just start there, because I want to get to some current events and things that are unfolding, some of the conversations you've been hosting. But American Resistance, the inside story of how the deep state saved the nation. I hope that I'll be able to do a deep dive, like an official interview for the book, and then I'll promote it with like you holding it, or me holding it, I think is more how it should be done. Anyway, this book is about a certain brand or type of people that were working in government during the Trump administration. Is that right? Tell me more.
Yeah, no. Look, the book is about the story of how it could have been much, much worse. I mean, as bad as the Trump administration was, this man was a fountain of terrible ideas surrounded by other people who had really terrible or evil agendas. And the question is, why didn't that happen? And the answer is that even when some of the checks and balances we thought we could count on, like the Congress and the courts, broke down, there were guardrails, and the guardrails were government professionals, civil servants, military, intelligence community, foreign service officers. And the guardrail was people who took an oath to the Constitution and placed it before party loyalty. So It was government professionals, but it was also, there were people he appointed who had served in governments before, who didn't want to launch a war against Korea, didn't want to put a moat full of alligators at the southern border, didn't want to shoot, Clorox into people's veins and stop that from happening.
Give me one or two, if you'd like, of people you talked to, because you talked to how many people for American resistance?
I talked to about 100 people, from cabinet level people, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Homeland Security, to Fauci, to some of the people about, Vindman or Fiona Hill, Masha Jovanovic, sort of the full range, and a lot of people you've never heard of who are whistleblowers or inspector generals. And there's a kind of a shocking punchline of this. I've worked in Washington for 30 odd years. Most of the people in Washington, contrary to what you may think, are good people. Most of the people in Washington have chosen to work for less money than they could make someplace else to serve the country, Democrats and Republicans. And, the Republicans for 40 years have been talking down government. Now they want to fire all these people. They want to get rid of the so-called deep state because they know it's loyal to the Constitution, not to them.
And you're not only talking about, when you say they want to fire these people or defund these people, you're not only talking about the FBI. But there's always been this anti-government thread amongst, obviously, conservatives and Republicans, and they've mostly targeted agencies like the IRS and any other. I mean, even, the public lands, fish and wildlife.
The Foreign Service. Trump hated the intelligence community, et cetera.
Right. But there was always this kind of defense, and very few people know this more about this than you, of defense industry, of the military, of law enforcement, and so on. But it seems like maybe they're abandoning that because they are a cult and not. Why do you think that would be?
I think they and Trump in particular did not want to have people in place who would put the country first and put the Constitution first and not do what he said. And remember, towards the end there, what he wanted, he was considering sending the military in to seize voting machines. But, in the middle of 2020, he wanted to send the military in to suppress BLM uprisings. And there were folks in the military who said, no, that's not what we do.
Right.
And, that's always been the case. There's always been some distrust of people in the military because they didn't automatically do what their bosses said. That's their job is to serve the country and the Constitution, and only to fulfill legal orders. And who determines what a legal order is? Well, they do that themselves a lot.
Very well said. Get the book, and I'm very excited to read it myself and learn more and talk more with you about it. And I completely agree with you about this idea that there are good people in Washington. There are good people everywhere. I would argue most people are good. It's just we don't comment on when people do normal things, like say please and thank you. We only come home and complain to our spouses about the person who cut us off in traffic, the person who did the thing that wasn't normal, and we don't report on planes landing for good reason, too. And that's why we don't talk about, quote, bureaucrats and people who are doing their jobs in Washington, if we're talking about government specifically.
If we devalue public service, right, then we won't have public servants. We need public service, whether it's education or police or defense.
I would prefer private service and private servants.
Well, that's going to happen. As soon as this podcast goes as viral as it will, and you have a big house in Beverly Hills and so forth, you will have as many servants as you want. I see it in your future. Or
at least a bigger shed. Keith, bring me a block of cheese. That's my fake producer. Dave, you sadly had to write a piece for the Daily Beast, which is actually really important, picks up on what we're talking about in terms of government and getting things done, where you were responding to where the Republican Party, the conservative movement has gone to. And I think, you start by talking about Carrie Lake, the governor, the woman who is now the GOP governor, former TV personality, local TV anchor, I guess. And now she is the Republican gubernatorial nominee for governor of Arizona. And she's got a long litany of things that she's said and done that are crazy and wacky. Most importantly, she's an election denier. But she basically talked about Ron DeSantis at a rally recently and referred to him by calling him, saying he has BDE, which stands for, I actually had to look this up. I guess I'm at that age.
Yeah, sure you did.
Big dick energy. And and then you go on to talk about the former president who, of course, said women let you grab them by the pussy and then still got elected, which you make the point, to some extent, this sells, this works. And this piece at the Daily Beast, which everybody should read, importantly, is titled "Dems Do Big Fucking Deals. The GOP Does Fake Big Dick Energy." So help me understand what you think or write about with the Republican Party, the conservative movement, what they become or what is appealing to them about this kind of fake masculinity, I call it.
Yeah, it is. And, it's bizarre the degree to which the Republicans talk about masculinity. You've got Republican talk show hosts and they're talking about how being woke emasculates people. Ted Cruz said that it was turning the military into pansies. And he used that term. Obviously, I wouldn't use that term, but it's strange, right? This is politics, but why are they doing this? And part of the reason is that this is a last gasp of the white male hierarchy in this country. And they want to turn the clock back to an era in which they thought they were treated differently. And then, Trump compounded all of this with this kind of false bravado, Now, let's talk a little bit about big dick energy. Okay?
Yes, please. We should have started the episode with that sentence alone. Go ahead.
Yeah, right. And as you know, it was first coined term in 2018 in a rap song. And there's another one this year. And weirdly, and maybe you can explain this better than I can, recently it has referred to people like Pete Davidson.
Yes, I know now, Pete.
I don't get that vibe. But apparently Kim Kardashian said he had that vibe. And essentially it was low-key masculinity. She used another term, DTF, which I'm not going to get into. But, low-key masculinity. You're looking it up. I can see you Googling
I'm looking
DTF.
up that there's another person this has just happened to. Go ahead, though.
But in any event, the idea here is that they're very confident. They don't need to make a big deal out of it. Whereas Trump, there's a certain other kind of group of people that drive big cars, have flashy people around them, always want to be the center of attention. And they have really what I would consider to be LDE, right? Because they're speaking from insecurity. And the Republican Party right now is speaking from a recognition that the majority population, women, are rightfully gaining more power, that the emerging majority population, minority people, rightfully gaining power, and that, these sort of cis white men are, relatively speaking, losing power, but actually it's because things are sort of getting to where they ought to be.
Yeah.
And this becomes their sort of core grievance. But it's fake BD, it's not, and Ron DeSantis, which with his kind of stormtroopers beside him, and Trump with his kind of, I don't care about the law. If these national security documents are here and I want them, I'm taking them home. People see that as kind of, strength in the face of, these trends that they fear.
Well, there's also a threat about that nobody, and that's always been present too, Dave, that nobody can tell me what to do, what to drive, what to eat, what to take that isn't mine. That's always been an attitude.
But of course, these people express their power, assert their power in ways that reveal their weakness. You live in Florida, right?
How dare you?
Sorry, where do you live?
Just north of New York City, the great Rockland County, where polio is back.
Sorry, Rockland County. Sorry, I didn't mean that. Well, but you go a little bit north of Rockland County, you'll see this. Have you ever seen a pickup truck with testicles hanging off the back of it?
I'm sorry if that was what your point was. I grew up in a cornfield outside Syracuse, New York, and I actually have I seen that? I modeled for the original
Did you?
Yes, those are my balls.
Well, congratulations.
I don't talk about it because I'm not insecure like these people you're saying, but you mentioned it.
Exactly. But it's like, they somehow, they think this makes them look powerful, right? It's a little bit like, another thing that I really never quite understood. Sometimes you see a garbage truck drive by and it's got mud flaps of a naked woman. Now, do you think that's attractive to women? A garbage truck with a mud flap. Do you think, I think that driver is a big, strong man because he's got mud flaps of a naked woman?
Well, he's also the man who often screams out his window at a woman, and women, for the most part, don't like that, is what from my understanding.
But that is a sign of weakness. You know what else is a sign of weakness? Having 6 AR-15s.
Yes.
Right? And so they're sort of modeling masculine behavior, what they think of as masculine behavior, because they're afraid and they're weak. And, they drive pickup trucks with Trump on the back, or they participate in boat flotillas that show that they have the strength of, armies of toothless high school dropouts. And this is what this trend is about. And Carrie Lake was celebrating. She mentioned DeSantis first and then Trump. But then again, Carrie Lake, she just endorsed a candidate who, is pro-Nazi.
Right.
So,
he is. And also, just before I come back to the article, because the better part of the article is not your diagnosis, which is really interesting, what we've been talking about that thread of whatever you want to call it, MAGA movement, Republican conservatives. I don't know what you want to refer to them. But the better part of the article is when you pivot to the approach Democrats have taken. But two quick questions, which is, one big one, I guess. I saw your retweet, I think it was Brian Tyler Cohen, of this Oklahoma representative. You just mentioned Carrie Lake supporting the Nazi. Then there's this guy running for state senator or House in Oklahoma who has had to defend a statement that he thinks that gay people should be executed, specifically stoned to death. And I thought what I had was a clever tweet, not a Rothkopf type quality, but that the U.S. Should have been always more focused on Oklahoma than Kabul. Than Afghanistan, to make the point that the real threat has always been here with these types of extremists, this idea that gays throw people off buildings in Iraq, and that's why we're there to defend them. We have those people here, Dave.
No, we do. And I think, frankly, that movement of embracing extreme hate is accelerating at a pace I never thought possible in this country. And it is because Trump and those behind him have made white Christian nationalist fascism the core of that party. And each element of that, the racism, the intolerance, the hatred of the rest of the world, and the desire to eliminate democratic institutions and impose their will on everybody else, have been embraced by the mainstream. They are defended by the mainstream of the Republican Party right now. Yes. And so it is giving license to all these complete nuts to come out of the woodwork. And, that guy you're talking about in Oklahoma was saying gay people should be stoned to death. I know this because I'm a Christian.
Yeah. Apparently his wife left him. And he lives in an efficiency, according to the video I watched him on YouTube. But I don't want to be mean to this guy.
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of these, a lot of the most masculine guys that are there are incels of the, irredeemable sort.
Yep.
These people have psychological problems. Donald Trump is not a healthy man. No, seriously, this is not an army of America's best and brightest.
No doubt about it. But you say the Republican Party, I think, is welcomes this or even engenders it. But I just want to get your take and maybe split a hair. It's always been led by conservative or Republican media. Tucker Carlson last night went off on, who was it, for talking about himself in the third person. He did a whole piece about this. And of course, no one has done this more famously than Trump. It's not a big deal to necessarily even do such a thing. But the point being, the right-wing media is really what fans the flames. These Republicans in Congress and state houses, I don't even think they're smart enough to come up with the talking points that Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity, and now Alex Jones give them every day.
And absolutely true. And they sort of turn to Fox and they say, what's permitted? What are we going to get support on? Right. What is Laura Ingraham and Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson gonna support? And that's why, when you sort of tell the history of this period of time, the great villain is Rupert Murdoch. The great villain of American decline is Australian, although Ronald Reagan, gave him the easy pass to becoming an American citizen so he could start buying up American TV stations at the intervention of Roy Cohn, mentor of Donald Trump.
I just watched the HBO documentary about him, and I knew maybe a third of that, but everybody should watch that. It is so relevant to today and so important. Go ahead. Sorry. But yeah, I mean,
it's totally true. And before we came on the air here, you and I were talking about how predictable this was or wasn't. And another thing that people should do is go back and look at sort of late 70s, early 80s reporting in the Village Voice by a brilliant journalist now dead named Wayne Barrett.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Wayne Barrett wrote about Donald Trump, wrote about Roy Cohn, wrote about how, the sort of suppurating wound from which they crawled into our society and the threat that they represented. And this was predictable back then. And, when Rupert Murdoch was trying to weasel his way into American society and fulfill the 10-year-old at that point wet dream of Roger Ailes that we have a conservative media establishment, he turned to a lawyer named Roy Cohn, and Roy Cohn connected him to Ronald Reagan's then head of the CIA, who wanted some good publicity, Bill Casey, and Murdoch gave him the publicity. Casey gave him the entree to Reagan. Reagan gave him the ability to go become a citizen, start buying up Metromedia television stations, later repealed the Fairness Doctrine. Mm-hmm. And so if you take Roy Cohn plus Roger Ailes plus Ronald Reagan plus these several actions plus Rupert Murdoch, you get Fox in the 90s. Fox in the
Rush Limbaugh.
And Rush Limbaugh and right-wing radio, and it sort of all feeds on itself. And that, if you want to, you could spend 24 hours a day listening to people saying, if you're white and you're male and you're Christian, you're better, and the Jews and the gays and the women are out to get you, and we need to use every means at our disposal to put them down.
And I have listened to that for years, off and on, and just it's important that people know why people believe what they believe. If you want to know, spend an hour, 10 minutes listening to right-wing media, as everybody should, and they will tell you, as Ben Shapiro did, the Democrats are trying to scare you about COVID because they want to control you, and then he took a break to read a live read for Body Armor. So he doesn't want to... The Democrats want to scare you to control you. Now go buy Body Armor.
Ben Shapiro is one of the classic examples of this group that I'm talking about here. Yeah. I don't know that you know this, and I may make you feel bad since I'm sitting here talking to you. But I once wrote a book called Superclass, which was about sort of how global elites had more in common with each other than the countries they came from, and this appealed, and I ended up on InfoWars. Did an interview there, and I got to tell you, I wanted to take a shower after I was done
I
with
just
it.
found it. Alex Jones versus Dave Rothkopf. It's on YouTube.
It was just...
Oh, my God, Dave, I have to end this interview and your life.
Yeah, well, it was, the publisher was like, oh,
anything else you want to confess while you're in my confessional?
Yeah, no, it's like, hey, I didn't go there because I liked the guy. I went there because I was having an argument with the guy. And he was like, well, doesn't, Kissinger and the Jews control everything? And I was like, well, no, Alex, actually, no, that's not true.
I thought you were selling food buckets, survival food buckets, and that's what you were doing. But I'll have to watch this. Wow. Joining us now, Dave Rothkopf. He is a Soros member, if you know what I mean.
I'm having a flashback.
Okay. There are two more. I'm sorry for that, and there's a lot of follow-ups, but there are two more big questions I want to ask you, and I know I got to let you go here. But first of all, I've got to get your take. This is the day I'm going to post this the day after news broke late last night, maybe around 8 p.m., that there were 300 documents in total that Trump took. About 150 is what the FBI got. Apparently, he had already turned in 150 or something. But this reporting, I guess the New York Times, or I don't know who got it first. What does this change about the news? I haven't talked to you since the search warrant was executed, as we say here editorially on Stand Up, not raid happened. What does this latest development mean, though, Dave?
I think it means a few things. First of all, the Republican effort, and I suspect one of the reasons that there have been these leaks, the Republican effort has been to minimize this whole thing as, tempest in a teapot. And the reality is that every time new information breaks, it's bigger and bigger. 300 pieces of information is a lot. A lot of that information was apparently top secret, compartmentalized, special access program information, which means it's the most sensitive information in the world. And by the way, even if it were declassified, and there's no evidence that it was, and by the way, even if it were declassified, it would still be a crime to take it. The real problem here, if you care about national security, is by putting these documents in the wrong hands or letting them possibly fall in the wrong hands, you can reveal intelligence sources, put people's lives at risk, put national security secrets at risk, and so forth. And so, the crime is getting bigger and bigger. I think another revelation in the story is that Trump went through the boxes himself.
I was going to ask you about that. The reporting says that Trump himself went through the boxes, and a question about journalism. How would we know that to the point that it would be reported at a reliable news outlet? That Trump himself went through the boxes means you have, I think, two sources telling you that. Yes. Is that right?
Yeah, no, I mean, typically, and this is the New York Times, so typically you've got two sources, probably Trump insider sources. But it's relevant, because, at the time, remember, the first crime was stealing the documents. The next crime was not giving back all the documents. Trump was then trying to say, well, this was just, the moving men who did it. It wasn't me. This says, no, there was you for both those crimes. But then there's a third crime here, right? And the third crime is obstruction of justice, because the government said, give us back all the documents. And they gave them back, say, 150 or whatever the number was, but they kept 150. And if he went through it and said, we're going to give him this one and not that one, that's a different kind of a crime. And then they signed a document saying we've given them all back, which is a different kind of a crime.
What's now, that the blue folder with the transcripts of my conversations with Putin? Let's keep that one here. Keep it here.
Yeah, well, exactly. But all these things are important. These are very serious crimes. If you stole one document, you'd be in jail for years.
Yeah. Dick Morris, right?
But Dick Morris, Sandy Berger took documents, ruined his career. David Petraeus took documents. Reality Winner took one document, went to jail for 5 years. These are serious crimes. But you want to know something? They're not as serious as undertaking a coup against the U.S. government.
Yeah, right. Exactly. You make a point, I think, or someone did. They're not more serious than other. They're just more. I don't know.
No, right now they're the ones we're focused on. But let's not lose focus on the coup attempt, the 12 obstruction of justice attempts, the collaboration with, the Russians. I'll tell you something. Let's just set all this aside. Let's just, for our own amusement, let's just say one other thing. 1 million Americans died of COVID. Every study that's taken place so far has said that several 100,000 at least died because of bad policies that were directly linked to Trump trying to cover up the COVID epidemic. If there was nothing else, we would be talking about hundreds of thousands of dead Americans, right?
Yes, we've always talked about the mistakes of
presidents. We don't even talk about that. Yes. It's like, oh, I'm sorry, we don't have time. I'm sorry, this segment's over. We can't really talk about that.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm also glad you mentioned the segment is over, because there's one more question I want to ask you, but I've had you here for a long time. Do you have time for one more about your article? Because you do. Sure. You pivot in this article that I mentioned a bit ago at the Daily Beast about the big dick energy. You pivot to what Democrats are doing. And I think that it's a really important point to talk about this, because this many major pieces of legislation, but most recently, the biggest legislation affecting the climate crisis was just passed. And I get worried it's a one-day story, even though it's the type of thing that will affect my kids and their kids if they choose to decide them, if the planet isn't already baked over. You write, meanwhile, Democrats have taken a much different approach. They're often not flashy. They're often soft-spoken. They're often the nerdy students who studied hard. And then you go on to say, instead of greasing up their bodies and swinging into battle on the nearest vine, which is what you basically are saying the Republicans have been doing with the big dick energy, the Biden Dems have piled up real accomplishments. And then you have this amazing list. It's great to see it in one paragraph in one article, the Daily Beast. Just talk a little bit about their style and their accomplishments, and then, Dave, I'll let you get back to whatever you do with your life. Yeah,
no, I have a vine to swing from, but
swing in on it. I saw that.
Yeah, right. But Biden has had this kind of superpower, and to a lot of people, it's his weakness too. And that is, he tunes this stuff out. He just puts his head down. He's seen it all, and he came into office and he decided, the way I'm going to win re-election, the way I'm going to move us on from Trump, is I'm going to govern, because he didn't govern. I'm going to do programs that help Americans, because the Republicans had power for a bunch of years and all they did was one big tax cut program for the rich. And he's going to say, and I'm going to do this. And if the Republicans come along with me, great. And if they don't come along with me, I'll find a way around it.
Well, all they did, sorry to interrupt, they undid a lot. But go ahead. Yeah, that's governing too, undoing
but here we are, 20 months in or whatever it is to the Biden presidency. And I'm not going to do the whole list, but you have the American Rescue Plan, which lifted hundreds of thousands of children out of poverty, created jobs. You have the bipartisan infrastructure package, the biggest package of its kind since the Eisenhower administration. You now have this latest Inflation Reduction Plan, which is the biggest climate plan in American history. He's created more jobs than the last 3 Republican administrations added up, more jobs than any president in history. He ended the longest war in history. He built NATO in a way that, NATO was down for the count, and NATO has now got Finland and Sweden about to join it. He stood up to Putin in Ukraine. He's got, any minute now we might see a new agreement with Iran on nuclear weapons. We got back in the Paris Accord. He's put through more judges than any president in history, the most diverse administration in history. Oh, yeah, there was gun control legislation. That hadn't happened before. Legislation to help veterans who are suffering from burn pit exposure. There was the CHIPS and Science Act to help us be less dependent on foreign sources of semiconductors and more competitive with the Chinese. There has been a host of executive orders to undo what Trump did, as you said, and on and on and on. And I think, their plan is, look, if you got a job and you didn't have one before, you'll be predisposed to vote for us. If you benefit from these programs, if you care about the world, if you care about American leadership, I don't have to thump my chest. I didn't have to own a casino. I don't have to hang out with Vladimir Putin and hobnob with dictators around the world. In order to look strong, I am strong. And that's, by the way, real BDE, but I didn't want to put it that way. Biden uses the term big fucking deal. As you can see, I was very focused on bad language in this column, but I'm from New Jersey, not, you're from New York, and that's elegant. I'm from New Jersey. It's a lot tougher. We use tougher language. Yeah,
the way you categorize all of New York State is deeply offensive and very erroneous, and does an injustice to a lot of us who grew up in lakes and streams. But listen, that's what I expect
you grew up
from
in a lake and a stream.
I did. I have gills.
What are you? You're like a water nymph?
I was a tadpole, but enough. Somebody doesn't read the Wikipedia file of the shows they go on. Dave, I'm glad I get to hobnob with you for a little while. I always love our talks. I really appreciate you joining me. I love your insights, and I hope everybody will go get the book and read your piece of Daily Beast and follow you on Twitter and subscribe to your podcast, which is so very good. You have great guests, and it's fun, and it's thoughtful, and I love it, and I listen to it every week. Thank you very much for joining me.
That is Deep State Radio, right?
Oh, I thought it was the Dave Rothkopf Experience. That's what I've been listening to.
Dave Rothkopf Comedy Hour. No, it's Deep State Radio.
Yes, it is. Deep State Radio.
By the way, you are the only person, my wife commented on this the other day. My mother and you are the only people who refer to me as Dave Rothkopf.
They call other people call you DJ?
David. They just call me David, but I like it. I like it.
Oh, I have
you remind me of my mom.
I'm sorry, I won't do that anymore, but it's a term of endearment because
it's fine.
I have two very close friends named Dave because I have a lot of white friends. And so I think that's why I do it. So I hope let's
let it be our signature here.
I've also coined on social media when I like so much of what you tweet, Rothkopf. I've made your last name a verb. I don't know if you've seen that, but I've done it.
I haven't seen it, but I'm really... I'm grateful for that, and I'll see if I can help that catch on.
Yeah, well, I'll keep doing it then, as long as you like it. David Rothkopf, everybody. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, and I'm so sorry to have associated you with Florida.
Oh, we kid our Florida friends. I love you guys. Come on. Thank you very much, David Rothkopf. And sorry if I missed some of his jokes because I think there's a little delay there on our link. But so funny. And I wish I improvised with him a little bit more because he is quick on his feet and super smart. Love talking with Dave. Definitely check out Deep State Radio. Go order an advance copy of his book and let Dave know that you heard him with me on Twitter. He's awesome on Twitter, so check him out there at DJ Rothkopf. I think that's why I thought people might call him DJ, but no, it was Dave Dave's mom and I call him, which I'm in good company, I imagine. Okay, so very happy to have Dave joining me and very excited. Always love talking to him. So much fun, and I think we're becoming friends. I'm not going to lie to you. He's very nice to me. He invited me to a thing maybe after we get done talking, after I hit stop, and I hopefully think it's going to continue to be a beautiful relationship. All right, well, another person I've become friends with a little bit at least. I've talked to her many times over the years as she's put out books and really important reporting on education when she was a correspondent for NPR, which she just left that gig after years. She was an education correspondent for NPR. She, before that, worked as a staff writer for Fast Company magazine. She's won tons of awards for reporting on education, technology, and innovation. She's also the author of 4 previous books before this: Generation Debt, DIYU, The Test, and The Art of Screen Time. And it's really great, this book. It's such an important book that she's written. The Stolen Year, How COVID Changed Children's Lives and Where We Go Now is the title of it. It's getting great reviews. Everybody wants to talk to Anya Kamanetz about this new book. I hope that you will go get it. I hope that you'll follow her on Twitter, by the way, at Anya1Anya. That's her Twitter handle. Check out her website, AnyaKamenetz.net, and subscribe to her newsletter, by the way, as well. And I love this book so much, I did something a little different. I asked Anya to read a little section from the intro as we started here. So, the book is The Stolen Year. My guest is the brilliant Anya Kamanetz. Here we go.
This is a book about Sammy's fear of dying and Patricia's feeling of drowning, Jonah's support network evaporating, Jeannie's spooky, sinking feeling. It's about the experiences of children and the people who loved them during the first year of the pandemic. Since 2014, I've covered education as a correspondent for National Public Radio. I used to have this mini pep talk I would give about why education was a worthy beat for a journalist. I would say, this country doesn't have universal health care. We are profoundly weak at providing subsidized affordable housing, mass transit, or other public goods. We have no childcare system to speak of, no paid family leave. But we do have this beautiful phenomenon where in every neighborhood, in every city, town, and rural community in America, there is a warm, lighted building that children can go to for 180 days a year. There, they will be safe, they will be fed, and they're likely to encounter a caring adult or two and maybe even learn something, all for free. Yes, our schools are segregated, inequitable, and starved for resources. They fail too many, but they have kept the lights on year after year for 50 million children. And in 2020, this was all taken away with no adequate substitute. Our society did not muster the resources or the will to take care of our children anymore, to offer these basics.
Oh, my goodness. So good. Thank you, Anya, for reading that. And congratulations on the new book, The Stolen Year. I really appreciate you reading that. And I know it must be hard to stop reading that because there's so much more. There's a whole book behind it. But congrats. And thank you for joining me. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me, Pete. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, I've been really enjoying the book, which I was happy and privileged, lucky to get an advance copy of, and been loving watching and your interviews that you've been doing, talking about it. But and I just always love talking to you and following you and your work, especially as you're in this kind of transition period in your career. But yeah, congrats. It's so important. The Stolen Year, how COVID changed children's lives and where we go now. Where were you when you came up with this idea, when you started thinking about the idea to write this book? Why did you think it was important? Of course, I want to talk about how you wrote it, because you actually interviewed children.
Yeah. Well, I think because we kind of checked in along the way, but I was here in my home office in Brooklyn. I was working for NPR. Obviously, my job went remote. My husband's job went remote. I had my 2 kids. They were 3 and 8 at the time when everything shut down. And so I was privileged to kind of be in the front row seat, seeing what was happening. And then because of my background, I talk a lot about growing up in New Orleans and covering Katrina as a young reporter, knowing that school shut down then. It was a society-wide catastrophe, but the school shutdowns were their own problem. I knew that this was going to be a really big deal. And that's why I started kind of following up and taking notes.
You covering Katrina is kind of an interesting, I'm not going to say perfect, but it's a parallel situation in terms of, and I think you write this somewhere in the book about, you make the point that Katrina laid bare all these underlying problems. And I think that's so important to always mention. So did the pandemic. What are the comparisons that you kind of knew, having covered what happened in New Orleans, what was going to happen to children in the U.S., families, and around the world?
Yeah. So, I want to address that in 2 parts. On a practical level, kids out of school for just a few weeks, it took them years to catch up, literally 2 years to get back on their academic trajectory. And then the high school kids in Katrina, the ones who were teenagers, they often didn't catch up. They didn't come back. Their lives got knocked off course. It's so easy for that to happen, especially if kids don't have the family support or the privileges. And I saw that. I knew that was going to happen. And I saw it happen in the pandemic, kids drifting into paid work or other kinds of pursuits, right? And then obviously the poverty, to some extent, the dislocation, that's similar. But on an emotional level too, the sense of abandonment, the sense of the failure of institutions, which hurt so much more. Obviously, in these 2 cases, right, you have the hurricane and you have the disease. Yeah. And those are potentially acts of God. They are things that happen in the world. And then you have, and that's one thing, it's one level of trauma. But then dealing with the fact that people feel forgotten, they feel like they're not taken care of, they feel like they can't trust other people, is devastating. And potentially even worse in the pandemic, because in Katrina, there was a social pull together effect. People trusted their neighbors and they helped each other out. And And we saw this incredible, terrible thing happening during the pandemic, where we started turning against each other.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking a lot about that as I was reading the book in terms of why we turned against each other, who was turning against who was helping each other, where the unity was. And it depends. I mean, I was also thinking about New York after 9/11 as we talk about these things. But, you also write, the decisions that led us here were made by powerful adults over centuries. You've covered policy and written about it your entire career. So I do have compassion for school administrators, much less teachers and obviously families, who there really wasn't a playbook for shutting down school during a pandemic, a virus like that. And so they had to think on their feet, and you had to have compassion and patience, I feel like, with administrators, but less so at the state level, certainly health departments, and certainly not the federal government, who knows all about pandemics and had been warned about them. So what is it about policy that broke down, that made kids hungry and scared and hurt? This is so much about what you write about.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what makes us weird as a wealthy, developed country is our incredibly decentralized school system with a very small role for the federal government at the top. And so countries that were able to reopen and started reopening, obviously, there were the ones that controlled the pandemic. So it wasn't a controversy, right? In New Zealand and South Korea.
Right.
They don't have the illness, so they were able to reopen. Countries in Europe started reopening in the spring of 2020, and definitely by the fall of 2020, they had these centralized, they had a unified voice across the health care establishment, executive leadership, ministers of education, and it was nationalized all down the row. And we didn't have that. We didn't have our healthcare, our public health officials and organizations speaking out strongly in favor of reopening schools. The president did, but he didn't have the credibility with half of the country, at least, right? And so the question then devolved to many states, and then devolved from there to individual districts. And, that was really how it got to be such a mess.
One could probably argue that if it were a Democratic president, or if the virus came back, and it very well could, or another one could, that maybe not half, but a huge portion of the country wouldn't then trust this president, Joe Biden, or the federal government in general, which goes back to your point about it not having a huge role in this, so many different kinds of districts across the country. What else did you, though, it's hypothetical, but what else could you say about the comparison in terms of the way other countries handled school closing and the virus and the pandemic in general versus our so many different states and districts? Is there, I mean, there's a lot to be said.
I think that there's two things, right? I mean, it wasn't easy anywhere. And in fact, there's documentation of learning loss happening all across Europe, with the exception of Sweden, which never closed their primary schools. And they're kind of the big outlier in that way. There were these fights over protocols and things like that. But I think there was a real difference in terms of the unity of the message, again, that was seen across different sectors of society. And in those kinds of countries and economies and societies where social welfare is not a dirty word,
right?
Where they're accustomed to talking about, needing to help and giving help to people.
Public school, public transportation, public education are not, that word is not a dirty word, even more important than social welfare, I guess. Like public, these are now dirty words here. Sorry, but I just wanted to.
No, you're the idea of a public good. Like, how did that become a contested idea? But it is. Yeah. I mean, there's a mainstream Republican point of view that schools should not exist. They shouldn't be run by the government. Government schools are a bad thing. That's what half of our politicians say. Yeah. And far worse than that, certainly coming from right-wing media. So, those other countries don't have nearly as much of an aversion to government and to social welfare and public goods. So they were able to unify more. What are you saying per that point? Well, first of all, they had resources in place to not have such a dramatic drop-off in child welfare. For example, we have this, it's sort of unique system that we have 30 million kids depending on school for meals. And while the system pivoted and we did send cash directly to families after a couple of months, that was long enough for kids to register a huge amount of hunger. So we didn't have those safeguards in place. We didn't have an infrastructure for giving cash grants to families. That happened eventually. And then we didn't have a public infrastructure for childcare. So talking about childcare, like our childcare centers are private. A lot of them are run in homes, and they didn't know what to do. They didn't have guidance. They didn't get funds to stay open, and a lot of them closed. And the ones that stayed open really didn't know how they were supposed to stay open. So that was a really terrible issue as well. That came from our lack of a infrastructure.
I suppose, and I'm sure you wrote about this if I missed it, the other issues, they didn't have to, in many countries, have to worry about the cost of healthcare. Certainly at the beginning, before the government tried to reassure people, we'll take care of it. If you've got COVID, you're not going to. But that at the beginning, a lot of people who didn't have healthcare at all, who worked in jobs where they were going to be around other people likely to contract the virus, they didn't want to. They were discouraged from going to the doctor because of the cost. So I think that's also probably a huge factor, the healthcare issue.
Well, and we talk about COVID spread. We're also talking about sick leave, right? Paid sick leave. And that also became the case for childcare workers, right, as well. Like, are they supposed to stay home? I talked to a childcare worker. This is far into the pandemic. This is spring of 22. Child gets dropped off to her. This is a totally normal situation. Child gets dropped off to her at her home. Within 2 hours, the child is vomiting, fever. The mother has tested positive for COVID, gone to work because she's trying to get out of a shelter. So, that's her situation. And the kid has COVID, and they've just been handed a child with COVID into their care with no information.
You did a great job reporting this book, as you always have, in terms of talking to all different kinds of families and illustrating so many different situations. And it's so important for that reason alone to buy and read it. But now it's time for me to read a part, because I think you ask all the so many important questions in this book and answer them. But here's where you ask them. You write, "The crisis exposed fault lines that run to the core. Why are our schools left to feed 30 million hungry children? Why does a single public school building in the United States of America lack soap, paper towels, or running water in the bathrooms? Why are 1 in 30 children homeless? Why do we not provide a public subsidy so that people who help take care of our children can make a living wage? Why no paid family leave? Why is it such a battle to get legally mandated services for children in special education? Why do children wait years to get mental health care? Why are such heavy government apparatuses set up to incarcerate children and separate them from their families, especially Black, brown, and immigrant children, and relative scraps dedicated to help those families stay intact?" These are the kind of questions that require a deep dive into history. Each chapter will give you some of that background. I actually just added deep. You did not write the word deep, and I read every word perfectly, but then I don't know if you noticed. I am so sorry. So well written, as those questions get asked and answered in this book. How did you write it? Who did you talk to?
I talked to about 150 experts in these fields, many of whom were in the middle of research because this was during the pandemic year. Relevant research. I followed 5 families in depth, and that was by checking in with them on text, on email, on Zoom, and then in the spring of 21 in person. And then I talked to as many different kinds of families that I could get a hold of. And that was through community groups and through different contacts that I had. Some of it was reporting that I would do doing for NPR at the same time. And then I would, elaborate on those conversations. But it was, it's hundreds of interviews, obviously, over multiple months.
Why talk about race in this book? Why did you have a whole chapter dedicated? What do we learn here?
Yeah. So first of all, because it's a timeline of 2020. And if you're covering 2020, you have to talk about race, because you have to talk about how the country exploded after George Floyd. And secondly, because so much of what came up during the pandemic was tied to our country's history with race and racism. That obviously the social determinants of health, right? So why Black and brown families were more harder hit by COVID, became more cautious about COVID, cautious about vaccines, why there were a population that were, and Asian Americans too. I mean, this is a year in which Asian Americans really experienced a lot of racism, a lot of hate crimes and attacks, right? And it affected how we responded to the pandemic because we have such a segregated school system still. And in the spring of 21, we could see in the data that white kids were back in school, and broadly speaking, Black and brown kids were not back in school. And that was something that had a lot of different reasons behind it, all of which relate to how race works in this country.
Yeah, we can go so much more into that, but let me skip back to another issue that you write deeply about. I mean, we could say gender now. I mentioned race. You could say gender, but what you write about, obviously, is childcare, which is more comprehensive, but it is still obviously gendered for so many reasons. And I don't know, Anya, I like when you talk about this issue because it seems a little bit more personal to you. So I can hear it in your voice. You sound almost less objective for just a moment when it comes to this one. Go ahead. Yeah,
totally. I mean, the deal with taking care of kids during the pandemic, we have paid care and we have underpaid care and unpaid care. That's how we raise kids, right? Basically, we pay childcare workers like $12 an hour. Otherwise, it's mothers, it's grandmothers, it's dads too. But there was this incredible dynamic during the pandemic where there were all these stories about women are being forced out of the workforce. Mothers are being forced out of the workforce. And it's like, who's forcing them? And there was a really classic, the New York Times did some good coverage, and they had a photo that really said it all. It was like the wife is in the bathroom wiping a child's butt, and the husband is in his office, his home office, with his headphones on a work call at the same exact moment. And that happened too much. We should have had a different kind of response, and it should have been a lot more equitable the way that it was divided. And because we saw that the brunt fell disproportionately on mothers, and mothers suffered from that. And I'm not this is not a personal thing. I'm not trying to sell my husband out, but I saw that happening, and I see a lot of marriages fracturing as a result, to be honest.
Yeah, especially I'm just assuming, especially those with younger kids. I think you wrote a line in here somewhere about parents reliving the kind of energy levels or schedules of having a newborn or an infant, a toddler that needs a lot of attention even when the kid is older because they're not in school. Parents get a break when their kids go to school to some extent, but that wasn't the case. You're always on top of each other. Why? I thought it was really interesting. And what I learned on every page of this book things I didn't know. But the thing that I learned the most about that I really didn't know was about child separation and what happens in the courts. Were you surprised that this was a major issue? Did you anticipate this as a reporter, that this was going to be something that families would have to deal with as a result of a pandemic?
Pete, I'm so happy you asked about that because I'm not getting asked about it enough. And it really was something that galvanized me. I knew a little bit of the child welfare system through friends of mine that worked in that field. But basically, what we're talking about here is we have about 400,000 kids that get put into homes every year. And a lot of people who work in that field or are close to that field are styling themselves now as child welfare abolitionists. And they're talking about this system as being a family policing system rather than a child welfare system, because the outcomes for kids who go into this care are not good. And all too often they are re-scarred, re-traumatized. They're not kept safe. And when you step back and look at the reasons that they get removed, everybody is against child abuse. Nobody is in favor of child abuse, and child abuse is wrong and should have consequences. But one of my best friends has spent the last 15 years defending families. He's part of a nonprofit that provides counsel to families who are in a child removal process. And really what you see again and again are these Kafka-esque scenarios where something goes wrong, you come to the attention of the scrutiny of a child welfare officer, a case gets opened, and then you have to fulfill these insane requirements to try to get your kid back. And during the pandemic, as I mentioned, it was really up to the foster custodial families whether or not there was going to be any contact. So some families didn't see their children for up to a year, where normally they would get that face-to-face visitation, which is getting that visitation is part of getting your kid back, because you have to reestablish first it's 2 hours and then it's overnight. And so it was just, that's devastating to me as a parent. And just knowing that this system needs to change, that it's so disproportionate that more than 1 in 2 Black and more than 1 in 2 Native households are going to get a knock on the door from child welfare. And that is a legacy that stretches back centuries of people coming and taking your kids away.
Tell me one specific story. This is, again, a really jarring section of your book. Give me, a story that might be typical that you learned about.
I mean, there's so many different stories, but I think, Heather is one of the moms that I spent a lot of time with, and she was really struggling. She was in substandard housing, no heat. She has 8 children that she's raising. She's already given up 2 kids to child welfare she had them when she was a teenager, and they were surrendered. But the other 8 kids remain in her care. During the pandemic in May 2020, when schools and childcare has shut down, she got into the habit of locking the doors on her kids when she went to work. And one day, one of her kids, her 7-year-old boy, ran off with 2 friends into a nearby abandoned house, which Heather says was being used as a trap house, like a drug dealing house, which might explain why when they came through the window, there was a man in his 20s who shot them.
Oh, right.
So, okay. Yeah. I mean, it's so much, right? I just want to say I visited this little boy. I visited his family. He was doing much better. He had just adopted a kitten. He was looking forward to playing football in the fall. So he got over this, but oh my God. Right. So then child welfare shows up. Okay. You had an injury. Your kid was, by the way, the newspaper story called him a burglary suspect, a 7-year-old burglary suspect.
Jesus.
So there's that. I know. So DSS shows up. That's the Department of Social Services. And they tell her, you should be doing floor time, which is like get down on the floor and play with your kids. It's like very generic advice. They don't give her counseling. They don't give the kid counseling. They don't give them money. They don't give them anything. They just give them 6 weeks of home visits and then they close the case.
It's such a broken system that the pandemic laid bare, and that you write about the how it's so broken in this book, using people's lives like the way that you just did in such an important way. To fix it, we need different policies. We probably need different people. And obviously we need money and resources, for which we have. But there are a lot of different specific types of families and children, and obviously players here. I haven't talked about teachers, and I haven't talked about special ed needs, which you go in depth in. So I guess with my last question, I want to just ask the one that I think most people probably can relate to, even families like yours or mine who weathered the pandemic okay. Our kids are okay. Yeah. Mental health. I mean, I don't know exactly what question I want to ask about this last section of your book, but what would you say about it before people go and buy The Stolen Year?
So I want to talk about that. Thank you so much. I want to talk about that. We're okay, because I really want us not to rush to it's all in the past. It's fine.
Great point. Yeah. Who knows?
Yeah. Well, and just I think that mental health ultimately is going to come. I've been looking at this paradigm of resilience versus post-traumatic growth, right?
Yeah.
Resilience is we bounce back. Okay, right. We're fine. It's nothing happened. Growth is I have a life story, and in that story, there's a thing that I went through, a hard thing that my family went through. And I lost some stuff, and I also gained some stuff, and I'm stronger because of it. And that's who I'm going to be going forward. I'm going to be the kid who went through the pandemic and has this stuff to show for it. And that's what I'm trying to forge with my kids. To be able. Yeah. Yeah.
So well said. Book is so good. And when you're done with the initial round of interviews, I hope you'll come back and we'll get even more in depth as I finish the book. Before I let you go, you are a person I have to ask about student debt. There's going to be an announcement today by the President of the United States. I'm not sure why the executive branch gets to decide such things. I haven't been paying close attention to this issue. I think it's an interesting issue, and it's a really important issue. What do you think he's going to do, and would you weigh in on what should be done?
Yeah, so it's executive authority because essentially this money is lent out and guaranteed by the Department of Education, which is under his jurisdiction.
Okay,
and he can sign. It's writing off debts essentially. What he can do is he's talking about forgiveness, and he's talking about means tested forgiveness. I think that there's been 20 years or more of advocacy leading up to this point, and I know a lot of people out there who are really celebrating because this forgiveness is a down payment on the idea that, again, education is a public good, that it should be accessible across the board. That said, there are fair-minded people. There's also a lot of unfair-minded people, but there's fair-minded people saying, I'm not so sure that writing off the debt in a one-time thing without a plan going forward to lower the cost of higher ed is going to necessarily make a big difference. It might benefit this group of people, but what's it going to do for the kids that are coming out?
Right. Fair question.
What's the long term? Yeah. So, and I mean, the activist answer to that is we're just getting the ball rolling here. We want college to be affordable. We want it to be free and accessible to everyone. And releasing people from this debt is going to be an economic stimulus. It's going to be racially well-targeted. It's going to help people who were affected by the pandemic. And we're going to keep working on the rest of it. And so not helping people now is not going to help people in the future either. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's like save this could you just save our generation who you screwed before you screw the next generation? You guys, it's up to you to figure out how to not screw, and maybe we can help. But, if you could help us out, it'd be nice to be able to afford to live and not have to pay. Of course, you wrote the book Generation Debt. So that holds up. The student loan section certainly does hold up. And you're talking to all these activists about it. It'll be really interesting to see what decision it comes, today. And I look forward to reading your tweets and reactions to it and finishing this book. Anya, congratulations. What an amazing and important contribution that you've made. And I'm really always excited to see what you do next. Hey, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Pete. I really appreciate it, as always.
All right, there you go. Anya Kamanetz, everybody. I hope that you enjoyed that conversation with her, and I hope that you'll go get the book. I hope you'll follow her on Twitter and mention to her, some of you have been slacking. Some of you show up every day on Twitter and that listen to the show and go on and thank the guests, but some of you have been slacking. But to those of you who do it like every day, thank you. Hap Connors doesn't get enough credit. Obviously, Tina and Kim and John Carroll and the great Pete Coe, and who else am I missing that's out there promoting the show on social media? Mindy Cunningham has been great. A lot of MVPs. I'm missing somebody, and they're gonna yell at me and think I'm taking them for granted. But so many of you guys are really active on Twitter specifically, and I'm going to try to get more active on all social media, and I'm going to try to cut and promote more video across TikTok and YouTube and Instagram and Facebook. I have to hire someone to do that, though. I'm not going to do that myself. So if you or someone you know is interested in working on the show or a few hours a week for me, I'm just tagging this at the end for people who might still be listening. I've been talking to Dr. Barry Hummel about doing a little work, but it's a lot, and I don't know. I mean, I don't know how many hours it's going to be, but I've just been having so many great conversations with guests, and I really want to share the video and more of those conversations with different platforms so more people can hear or see or share it, and hopefully, become a part of our community for sure. Because there are so many amazing people. So if you or someone you know would be interested in doing a few hours a week, cutting video and then posting it across social media platforms, let me know. standupwithpete@gmail.com. And I'll probably put that in the subscriber newsletter and other places. Maybe even go wide and mention that I'm looking for someone on social media myself. We'll see. Okay, thank you so much for listening today. Thank you so much, Dave Rothkopf. Thank you so much to Anya Kamanetz and to everybody. All your nice words welcoming me back. It's been great to be back just after a week off, and I love you guys. I love doing this program each and every day. Thank you very much. Can't do it without your subscription. So subscribe now, standupwithpete.com. And John Carroll, take us out. I'll see you at tonight's Hangout. Forgot to mention that. It is Thursday. Tonight, I will hang out with you, and looking forward to it. I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up now. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. Alright, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up and show obedience to the voice inside. And listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.